Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Julia Harton. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Community and Regional Planning at UBC. And I would like to, as a moderator, I would like to welcome you to today's event, Patriarchal Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, a Gendered Discourse of Double 11. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that UBC and myself today are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I would also like to welcome our speaker and discussant, Dr. Bintu Meng and Dr. Amy Hanser. So Dr. Meng is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics, where she also directs the double degree master's program in global media and communications together with Fudan and the LSE Fudan Global Public Policy Research Center. We're very, very lucky to have her here with us, if only virtually, to speak on the Double 11's shopping event, as she has published widely on media, gender, and the political economy on media industries. We're also lucky to have Dr. Amy Hanser join us as the discussant for this event. Dr. Hanser is an associate professor here at UBC in the Department of Sociology, and also has worked gender work and cultural aspects of markets with an area focused on China. Of course, I would also like to thank the Center for Chinese Research, the Institute of Asian Research, and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at UBC for their generous support in bringing this event to life. Yeah, and just a little bit of housekeeping. We're gonna have Dr. Meng speak for about 30 to 40 minutes and then give some time for Dr. Hanser to respond, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Meng, and I hope you enjoy this event. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me first share my slides. And before I start my talk, I would really like to first thank Julia for the opening introduction and also for inviting me to give this talk. I also want to thank Lisa for all the hard work she's putting in organizing this, and also to thank Amy for being generously agreed to be the discussant for this. I have used your work, and I think actually also I also cited one of your papers in this particular article. So I thought I would like to open the talk by saying that I thought the timing was interesting. I thought when Lisa first Julia first got in touch with me and said you would like to organize an event on Double 11, but then the day itself is actually a public holiday in Canada, because I didn't realize that Canada also observe Remembrance Day. We certainly do that in the UK, but in the UK it's not a public holiday. Actually, part of the reason that initially got me to write this article was actually in 2014. So it's on the Remembrance Day of 2014, which was the centenary of the First World War, of course. There was this huge installation outside the Tower of London called Blood, Sweat, Land and a Sea of Red. So it's an installation of more than 80,000 red poppies outside Tower of London in remembering the World War I. And in the meantime, on that very same day, I also saw on Chinese internet and also on social media, this sort of evening gala being streamed on the website of Alibaba, and in sort of celebrating this shopping festival. It's quite a visual spectacle, and I thought there is also such contrast between one type of imagined community being invoked through this art installation outside Tower of London. It's about the memory of the war, And on the other hand, we have another type of imagined community being sort of interpolated through this shopping festival. So I thought that was quite extraordinary. And another thing that also very much struck me was, of course, the gender aspect. So that's how we got into this research project. And I also want to acknowledge that I wrote the paper together with, at that time, one of my PhD students, and Yanning Huang. He is now an assistant professor at Xi'an Zhao Tong Liverpool University in Suzhou. So before we started the seminar, Tim was saying that he needs to know why we should stop calling it guangun jie. And of course, you know, they started Double 11, as you can tell from the way that the date is expressed. It started as a rather playful, I think mainly on university campus, of the celebrating being a bachelor, celebrating being single. So as you can see from this poster, as late as 2012, it was still known very much as the guangun jie. But I don't think at that time it was really well known outside of the youth culture circle and outside of the university campus. But by 2014, as I mentioned, if I remember correctly, that was also the first year that Alibaba had this kind of evening gala where they have this visualization of real-time transaction data feeding in from all over China, celebrating this huge shopping festival. So, you know, several things that struck us. One is that in a matter of a couple of years, Alibaba was able to appropriate this festival that was kind of part of the youth subculture and turn that into a national event. And secondly, what we also see, I think increasingly in the last few years, and now of course in the sort of aftermath of the COVID, although we are not, you know, we're not quite post-pandemic yet, but in China, certainly there's a lot of discussion about how to recover the economic growth. And there's a lot of emphasis on how this will help the economic recovery. It's not only going to help the economic recovery of China, but also it has this global significance. And I'm not sure if you can make out, for those of you who read Chinese, to make out this picture on the bottom right, on which it's it's about Wuhan. It's about the city of Wuhan, you know, where used to be the epicenter of the COVID. So it's about how this year at the beginning of November, Wuhan is getting ready for another big sort of celebration of Double 11. And interestingly, it used this kind of war language, talking about mobilization. So here in the Chinese text, it talks about how the e-commerce companies and the logistics and also the transportation are all getting ready, all geared up to fully prepare for this national shopping, the carnival, basically. And there's also a lot of discussion about how this is also a test on the commercial supply chain, on the logistics that China is able to sustain. So there's a lot of emphasis put in this about economic recovery. But of course, another aspect is a highly gendered mobilization here in two aspects. One is that if you look at the actual sales figure, the top sales, the products tend to be baby products or cosmetics, or the kind of domestic products that are usually purchased by women. And secondly, for those of you who follow Chinese social media, you would also know that the so-called 直播带货, right? Those who do this kind of live streaming on TikTok, on social media sites, to basically sell products. And so for those who do the so-called 女主播 and those who do this kind of video selling, also women is a very strong presence there. So here I have these two sales figures from the so-called two most successful 主播 in China. One of them is Li Jiaqi, who is a man, but he mainly sells cosmetic products. So he's really catering to female consumers. And the other is Wei Ya, who is a female host that sells basically all kinds of products. Now, so the highly gendered mobilization, of course, is not escaping the attention of the e-commerce companies themselves. And in fact, Jack Ma, back in 2014 himself, was very much highlighting the fact that the Double 11 is really relying on the purchasing power of Chinese women. But he also put on this kind of seemingly empowering spin on this by saying that they are taking care of the family. They are certainly making purchase, not just for themselves, but also for their parents, their husbands, and their children. So Chinese women are very altruistic. They take good care of their family. So the e-commerce websites themselves, the platforms, are also playing up the gender aspect and by catering to the female consumers. Now, of course, this is nothing new, right? Women being interpolated and called upon as consumer in chief has also been talked a lot in the Western context by feminist scholars when they look at the gender division of labor, women's role as wives and mothers. And of course, what comes with this is that they should be in charge of making purchasing decisions in the family. So this picture you see here, I baby my whole family, and it's a typical image of the consumer in chief, that if you are a good mother, you need to know what to buy and what kind of wise purchasing decisions you need to make. So as early as in the 1960s, Betty Friedan in her Feminine Mystique already talk about how women are encouraged to think that they need specialized products in order to fulfill their role as good housewife, as good mother. But of course, what goes hand in hand with this is that they are discouraged from pursuing actual careers. And Nancy Fraser and others also talk about how this emphasize on consumption, on being smart consumers, are also concealing the structural inequality between men and women's earning. And then in the Western context, in the whole post-feminist discourse, McRobbie also talked a lot about how the so-called girl power is often manifested through the consumption decision or the consumption power of young professional women who think that the feminist movement is already mission accomplished. We are now post-feminism because now women can do whatever they want and they are empowered already, and they demonstrate their empowered subjectivity through making purchasing decisions, through consumption. But for us, when we look at this, this doesn't really explain how this kind of trajectory is completed in the Chinese context from the socialist era, when women are encouraged to take part in the socialist construction, being called upon as shouldering half of the sky, to what we see now. So this picture is a picture I took in the subway of Shanghai. And it says here, and of course, there's a lot we can say about the body image itself, right? We can also do a visual analysis of her, the body image, but it says here, to praise a woman that she can purchase well is better than praising her to be able to earn money. So how did we get from the kind of socialist era when women are celebrated for being good engineers, workers, farmers, soldiers, and to where we are now? So how did the discursive shift took place? And this was really the core of our inquiry when we started this project. So I thought in order to understand how this shift took place, we need to look back at the state feminist project. There has been a lot of writing about this and it's a heavily contested issue, right? About to what extent the Chinese Socialist Revolution has brought liberation for women, or to what extent it's very much a patriarchal state project, really incorporating or appropriating women's labor. So it is a contested issue. But I think even for those who are generally positive about the liberating and the empowering aspect of the socialist revolution for women, there has also been a lot of critique looking at the limitation of state feminism in Mao's China, including, for example, the most recent one was the book by Professor Wang Zheng called Finding Women in State. So if we look at this, there's certainly a lot of gender discontent in this assessment about the socialist revolution. During which class struggle tend to encompass gender issues, and women's liberation was considered more of an economic and class issue rather than a cultural issue, and also the systematic blindness towards gender differences, and also other Marxist scholars have also talked about how even in the socialist discourse calling on women to shoulder half of the sky, but there has never been any call for men to go back home and share half of the housework and share half of the care work. So the gender division of labor, even though women are invited to join public space, but men are never encouraged to share the care duty within the family. So the gender division of labor within the family was left intact. And we can see this, even in the early writing by Dingling, for example, when she was in Yan'an, she wrote this piece. I still find every year, actually, on International Women's Day, I would dig out this piece and reread it because I thought that's such a powerful piece. 38节有感, right? Thoughts on International Women's Day, where in which she talked about how, even in a place like Yan'an, it seems that gender equality was part of the socialist agenda, but she was highlighting a lot of the gender inequality and including this systematic blindness toward gender difference during the high time of socialist revolution. And then, of course, after the Cultural Revolution and after what comes with the reform and opening up, is really a sort of a new wave of enlightenment. And in the 1980s and 90s, there was huge discussion about humanism, humanity, or retrieving humanism from what's being lost during the socialist revolution. So in that debate, in those intellectual debates, there was this attempt trying to sort of retrieve the feminine essence, which was considered being lost or eradicated during the socialist era. So there was discussion about the feminine essence, 女性气质, and womanhood. So what does it mean to be a woman? And clearly, the socialist definition of women during the revolutionary era caused a lot of discontent. So, for example, in Harriet Evans' book, the subject of gender, in which she did interviews with both mothers who grew up during the socialist era and their daughters who grew up in the 1980s. And you see this generational gap and discrepancy in the mother and daughters on different understanding about what does it mean to be a woman. And there's also a lot of, I think, grievance, often from the younger generation, thinking that their mother had invested too much in the socialist revolution, and they were really shouldering this double burden without being able to take care of the family. And even in some cases, there was this sense of alienation from their mother because their mother was so busy all the time. And coupled with this kind of shift in the intellectual discussion, in the cultural discourse, I think it's also important for us to take note of the broader political economic transformation. That is, as the so-called reform and opening up moves forward, the state is also retreating from the provision of equal employment opportunities and social care. Before this, I was attending just Deborah Davis' talk about family life in the 1980s in Shanghai. So if we think about the childcare, let's take that as an example, during the socialist era, and think about how childcare has now been heavily privatized, and also think about the kind of family, work or domestic chores that women could sort of rely on the public provision, and as opposed to now, how many urban middle class families, if you have both men and women working, often they need to hire someone to either take care of the children or have to rely on the older generation. So there is this general retreat of the state from the provision of equal employment opportunities and affordable social care. And if you look at, of course, the privatization of state-owned enterprise, clearly the data also show that urban women are more likely to be laid off by state-owned enterprises, especially for middle-aged women, and then it became incredibly difficult for them to find another job. And this was sort of also coupled by state, the branches like the All Women's Federation actually start to organize laid off women in finding jobs in being the domestic worker. So the 全国妇联 is actually doing a lot, helping the women to find work like being 月嫂, the taking care of the newborn baby, or become domestic workers. So there is this, on the one hand, it's increasingly the equal employment opportunities are diminishing. And on the other hand, there is the privatization and also the of affordable social care. So there is this general drive almost for women to go back to the family for both economic and cultural reasons. And in terms of the overall economic transformation, of course, there's also a reorientation of the economy from production-led to consumption-led. So it's within, I think, this sort of transformation, both at the political economic level and also in terms of the cultural shift, coupled with the discontent toward a socialist feminism, that we see this kind of discourse about the highly gendered discourse of Double 11 emerging. And in our article, we identify these two central themes. One is around the so-called 败家娘们, spendthrift chicks. And the term itself, of course, is derogatory, but sometimes it's also used in a seemingly positive or sort of an endorsing manner. So here, a male economist making these comments about how Chinese women are not only holding up half of the sky for the Chinese economy, but also, they make this very important contribution. And also you see on social media that how, Chinese spendthrift chicks are savior of the US economy. And then this year, because of the pandemic, there's also a lot of discussion, media discourse about how, this year, Double 11 is gonna really serve as a savior for the world economy to recover from the pandemic. And also in this, there's a clear, intersecting with this gender discourse is also a class discourse. That these two images that we saw on Chinese social media, I think we think that it clearly demonstrates this gendered aspect. So one of them is called the thrifty wives, and the other one is the spendthrift chicks. And aside from the age difference, there's also clearly a class distinction here. So what is the young middle class consumers are the ones that are being endorsed here. And there's also, I think, again, we can do a visual analysis of the image of these women and including their gaze and the different ways they are looking at the camera. What was also striking, and I think this is related to what I said earlier about the discontent towards state-sponsored socialist feminism, is also there was a lot of spoof and appropriation of socialist posters, and we collected some of these, as you can see here. So for those of you who have seen these posters before, you would know what the initial content is about. So they 工农携手向前进, the workers and farmers holding hands and marching forward, and now becomes the subtitle reads, please share your Taobao link with me. So it's a link towards having discounted shopping. And the other one was, I think initially was probably during the Korean War, and now it says on Double 11 staying vigilant against fire, against robbery, and against spendthrift chicks. So I think it's quite striking to think about what happened, in a matter of a few decades, that China seemed to sort of complete this transition from this socialist ethos to this ethos promoting consumerism and promoting also patriarchal capitalism. And I think in a way it's even more striking to think that a huge part of this was really the invention of one e-commerce company. But of course, the invention and also the discursive strategies developed by this e-commerce company, by Alibaba, was also heavily supported by the state, because the state think of this as a point of the end, as think of e-commerce as the engine of growth. We could go back to, so there was one thing I forgot to mention. So this top left image here is from about this year's Double 11. And if you notice the source of this article, so this was actually an article published on the Central Disciplinary Committee, Central Discipline and Inspection, Central Committee of Discipline and Inspection. And it talks about how we need to pay attention to this, that Double 11 is a stress test of the supply chain of China. And it also talks about the Central Committee of Discipline and Inspection also talk about that we need to be vigilant about those e-commerce platforms that have this kind of false or pseudo discount, and then they first raise the price before Double 11 and then have this kind of fake discount. So there was a lot of scrutiny about this and how this is about economic growth, but there was a total sort of absence of any kind of critical assessment of the gender aspect of this discourse. So in conclusion, as a feminist scholar, after we have critiqued the patriarchal capitalism, the discourse being sort of implicated in this celebration of the National Shopping Festival. How should we move forward, or how should we think about what would be a helpful approach for us to look ahead? And here I find Nancy Fraser's discussion about the politics of this redistribution and politics of recognition helpful, because from this perspective, we could argue that in contemporary China, there has been a dual process of a decline in the politics of redistribution on the one hand, and a complete obliteration of class discourse and class analysis of inequality and social discontent. And on the other hand, there is a consumption-based recognition of very essentialized gender difference. That is, when women are being celebrated as wives, as mother, as consumer in chief. And this is also linked with the so-called 女性气质, that's what defines their femininity, that's what defines their womanhood. And I think in this dual process, of course, the patriarchal state played a very important role. But on the other hand, I think interestingly, for those of you who follow this aspect and also pay attention to the kind of discourse and activities on Chinese social media, you would probably also notice there in recent years, there has been increasing visibility of urban middle class feminist activism. There are also the more radical branch of this urban middle class feminist, feminists who call for the 不婚不育, so they refuse to get married, and they refuse to bear children as what they consider as the ultimate resistance against this patriarchal order. But what I want to caution and want to note is that just because these are the most resourceful and also most articulate group of women, and they gain the highest visibility, that doesn't necessarily mean that they represent sort of the general view of Chinese women. And I think there's a very clear class and urban bias in the kind of feminist agenda that they put forward. And I would probably want to go back to Fraser's call about how we should take a bivalent approach towards gender emancipation in terms of redressing the social injustice. Redressing this social injustice requires changing both political economy and the culture. And clearly, what was lacking during the socialist revolution was really the broader cultural change and the discussion around the role, not just the role of women in the public life, but also the gender division of labor within the domestic, within the private sphere. So I think I'm gonna end there, and I would like to invite comments from Amy.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Meng. And I have to say, for those of you who are in the audience, I highly encourage you to read Dr. Meng's work. It's really wonderful and thoughtful, and this represents one small piece of the scholarship that she's produced, and I think really cutting edge on really contemporary issues in China, especially related to social media and the changing media environment in China. I guess I have a few thoughts to sort of contribute to this discussion and thinking about gender and consumption, and specifically the Double 11 kind of consumer carnival that that is about to take place in China, or is in process, actually. I guess my first thought in reflecting on Dr. Meng's presentation is that that it's so easy for us to sort of accept the modern consumer as some kind of natural presence in the market. And Dr. Meng's comments, I think, remind us how important the history is behind how consumerism gets evolves and gets constructed, and the important connections between in particular, modern consumer economies and the state, gender, family organization, and all of those kinds of questions. And I think in China in particular, I think already I feel like as I read contemporary scholarship on China, I already feel like that important state socialist legacy is already fading as people maybe don't even really think about it that much. But I think Dr. Meng's presentation reminds us how important that piece of history has been to contemporary China and to thinking about why gender looks the way it does. And I personally feel like I've long puzzled over how quickly the trappings of state socialism were replaced with very strong gender essentialist ideas about men and women. And as Dr. Meng has noted, a kind of beckoning of women to return to the family. And in particular, I found myself thinking a lot during Dr. Meng's comments about what that family looks like and how much it's organized in a kind of consumerist way. And I know Dr. Meng has written about motherhood and its place in this configuration. And I've thought about that a lot myself in recent research I've done, where the expectations of motherhood really have really expanded in ways that in some ways in lockstep with the expanding consumer market that offers women more and more ways to intensify their commitments as mothers and to display those commitments. One other thought that I would raise is, I think, something to think about in regards to China's modern consumer economy is what gets hidden behind the consumer image, this empowered consumer image. And it's really striking, I think in particular in places like Canada and many Western countries, we often talk about how our supply chains connect us to China, and that what's often behind the empowered Western consumer is a laborer somewhere else in the world. And it's really interesting to think about what those politics are in China between the consumer and the laborer, in particular, because they're not so far removed, and they're in many ways they're subject to the same state apparatus. And so, I don't know if Dr. Meng has thoughts about that question. In some ways, it pulls us away from the consumer, but I do find myself thinking about that relationship between the consumer and the worker, and also the logistics, right? Which may also have a gender component of who's actually transporting all of these goods that circulate through the e-commerce system that in many ways is actually very material. It's just the act of purchasing something becomes digitized, but all the other stuff is still a material process of making something and delivering it and then using it. And then maybe I would just conclude by thinking a little bit about, so, if we think about the importance of history and China's particular path to the Double 11 Festival, the close connection between the state and the family in constructing this particular political economy, and then the invisibility of the labor that goes into that. The next level that I think about is whether there are international implications of China's double 11 festival, if this is something that spills outside of China's borders, if the discourse is one that is it largely contained? Is it largely a nationalist discourse, or does it have, certainly I think the Chinese diaspora as it grows, I wonder what the place of, or you know, the impact of the Double 11 Shopping Festival might be going forward outside of China's borders. Okay, maybe I'll stop there. I definitely want to leave enough time for comments, and I see we only have about 15 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Meng, do you want to respond?
Yeah, maybe just briefly, because I do also want to hear if there are any questions from the audience. I think, first of all, your first point about how often now in the contemporary social inquiry about Chinese society, often the history gets lost. I can't agree more. And I think in a way of I'm probably particularly critical of my own discipline in media communication, because our field tend to be quite technology driven. There's this fixation on the digital future, so to speak. And often in looking forward to the digital future, I often feel there isn't really enough looking back at the history. And actually in my research, I always find that looking back at the history can be incredibly informative in making sense of the contemporary changes, and including not just contemporary, including the expectation and the vision about future. I think to a large extent, what Chinese people imagine as the future good life also has to do with the socialist legacy, the promise of the socialism and such. So that's one thing. And secondly, yeah, I think we can talk more about motherhood. I also want to do more research on that. I felt that paper I did about motherhood was really scratching the surface. And I think what's also interesting is that some of the recent policy changes, including cracking down on private tutoring, and there was actually, and also on video game playing, there was actually a lot of support, because the summer when I was in China is when the policy came out. So I sensed that there was actually a lot of support from Chinese parents toward this policy. But then, of course, whether the policy can really become a useful instrument for redressing social inequality, I think we need to wait and see, because many people say, for the middle class and upper middle class, they are still going to spend a lot of money in whatever way they can to put their kids in a more advantageous position. And thirdly, I think, the sort of connection, or whether there's any kind of mutual recognition between the working class who sort of sustain the supply chain and the production of this, as you said, the very tangible physical network of makes this happen, and the middle class consumers. I think there has also been quite a lot of interesting discussion in, for example, with regard to delivery workers, the food delivery workers. There was a very influential piece on Chinese social media talking about how these platforms are using algorithm to manipulate delivery workers so that they can be faster and faster. And then there was a video, also I think it's a little song that I don't know who authored that, but in the song it's calling for also the white collar middle class office workers who are usually the consumers of this kind of, who are purchasing the service of food delivery workers, calling for them to be more understanding, to show a bit more leniency, and not to leave 3 or 4 star harsh reviews just because the delivery worker was late for 5 minutes or something. So certainly I think there's also this attempt trying to shift a more structural problem into calling for some kind of more harmonious relationship between the working class and the middle class.
Thank you so much. Lisa is helping me monitor the Q&A, but it looks so far we don't, oh, there's one question. I was gonna ask one myself, but we got one from the audience. So, actually, I'm not sure, are the participants able to unmute themselves, or should I read the question?
You can read the question and then
okay.
Dr. Meng can answer it. And I'll also pop the question in the chat so everyone can see it as well.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you for that clarification, Lisa. Okay, I'm gonna read the question by Yijia Zheng. So the question reads or starts off by thanking Dr. Meng for giving the interesting talk, and they're saying, oh, question moved. They're wondering, how do you make what do you make of Li Jiaqi's success as a male sales anchor compared to the female competitors? Is he in a glass escalator in this female industry as selling female cosmetic products? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the very interesting question. Although I don't feel particularly qualified to answer that question, because I have to admit that even though I noticed his great success, but I haven't really paid attention, and I haven't really compared his 直播 and with other female beauty bloggers. So I'm afraid I can't really give you sort of a scholarly analysis of why he sort of just skyrocketed in this sector that used to be actually dominated by female vloggers. But I would like to hear your thoughts, whether you have any thoughts about what makes him particularly successful. And of course, now his slogan that 买它买它 buy it, and they become so popular. But I'm sure there's more to that in addition to the slogan itself. But I don't know, does he demonstrate particularly good knowledge about lipsticks? I didn't really pay close attention.
Thank you for that. And I think the participants are only able to participate through chat. So
Okay.
So I'll monitor that and see if there's responses. Thank you. There's another question by Paul Bowles, I believe is the pronunciation. I apologize if I mispronounce. So again, thanking you for the interesting talk. And then he's writing, I'm wondering whether you see any parallels or differences between the Double 11 event in China and the pre-Christmas shopping frenzy in many Western countries known as Black Friday, which is also taking place in November.
Yeah, I think when Double 11 was first promoted in China, it was actually emulating the Black Friday discount. But if you think about, first of all, now sort of the length of this whole period, that now as it starts as early as in mid-October, that these e-commerce companies have already started giving discounts, and all bill it as part of the Double 11 festival. And so in terms of the extensity and intensity of this, it's certainly much more than the Black Friday. And I also think that the gendered aspect is particularly prominent in all this discourse promoting that. And thirdly, I think the role of state is probably also unique because initially, of course, it's very much driven by Alibaba, but once it has gained the momentum, the state really started endorsing this and also promoting that as a very important engine of economic growth. So I thought the gender aspect and the state sort of endorsements are quite unique in the Chinese context. And if you look at the overall sort of the extensity of this shopping carnival, it's like Black Friday on steroids.
Thank you for that. I think I have time to ask my question now. So yeah, I was initially really, and it's more of a comment maybe, or a request for your comment. But I was initially really fascinated by this shopping event, festival, whatever you might call it, because I wanted to know, what does the success of something that started as celebrating being single, what does this mean for the cultural position or the societal position of singlehood, right? And I was really fascinated now to learn how actually the contemporary discourse is much more about motherhood and the woman again in relationship in family relations, right? Like the position of the woman as a family member and a family maker. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Has the discourse been taken over by positioning women again as mothers and family makers? Yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I also thought that, I'm not sure if I could really pinpoint when did sort of the previous connotation sort of stop circulating and when the new connotation started circulating. I also find it very curious that something started as a quite niche subcultural thing among mainly college students, and then being appropriated by Alibaba. I suspect initially Ali didn't really put a lot of thought into what guangun means, and they just thought that Double 11 is such a catchy phrase. It's very easy to use it and to raise the visibility. But if you think about in terms of consumption power, in terms of the consumption desire, certainly by playing that, by catering into women and calling for women, it's a much more profitable and a much larger market than single college students, right? So I think this shift of connotation was really the product of these companies, because for them, their attention is really on what is our target consumer group. So how can we shift this in order to better target those who have the most income and the highest income and the ability to shop, and also the desire to shop.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was wondering also if I could quickly ask a second question, a more broader question about gender and how it's perceived and constructed in China right now. I often, most of my friends in China are women that are not married yet, but I do have some friends that are women that have children and are married, and I feel like there's a very different perception of gender equality, and kind of this awareness of inequality only hits once you do have children and are still working and are expected to care for a domestic life as well. So I was wondering, yeah, generally, what's your take on that? That it's kind of this shift only, that mental shift only happens when it actually affects you personally. And among unmarried single women, there is still this clinging to this hope that actually women can do everything, can do anything. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think the key sort of change does take place when women get married, and this is also why I think among the well-educated urban middle-class women, increasingly they're saying, some of them would say, I'm a feminist, I'm against the marriage. And they also have this term for those women who think that they must get married, called marriage donkeys, 婚驴. So it's like a donkey that, being completely blindsided and doesn't really understand what it means to move forward, to jump into the trap of marriage. So I think definitely, and this of course is also linked with my research about motherhood, because there is so much being inscribed into motherhood, maternity, and what does it mean to be a good mother. And I think often especially for well-educated urban women, and now Vanessa Fong wrote about how the single child policy actually has done made positive changes to the right of women, because with only one child in the family, that family put more resources into the education of young women. So this is the environment that they grew up in. So in other words, there's also this kind of mismatch that when these urban young women, when they grow up, they had been told that they can do anything, right? They can do anything that men can do. But once you step into marriage, that's really a different story. Especially if you think about the workplace culture in China nowadays, the so-called 996, right? So the assumption of these companies basically is that none of their employees have childcare responsibilities or have any, their domestic responsibilities. So if all these private companies are and all these work units are making these assumptions about their employees, and then of course in any family, someone needs to take care of the kids, and then by default it's women. And then of course there's also the complicated relationship with the in-laws, and now also with the education, the fiercely competitive education system, there's also so much demand on women. Being a good mother is so much more than just taking care of the children. It's about not letting your child to lose on the starting line. It's that you need to cultivate, this notion of intensive mothering. Is really very much distilled in the mindset of urban middle class women now. So yeah, I think your observation is absolutely right. I think that the key shift really takes place. I think before they actually enter marriage, they wouldn't have really anticipated, because they had been brought up thinking that we've achieved gender equality.
Thank you. I just saw there's a comment in the Q&A section. I don't know if we have a couple more minutes to. I'll just quickly read it. It's by Yijia Zheng again to follow up on the comment earlier about the male host. So they're saying I also haven't watched enough streaming sales to have a well-informed answer, but I was wondering if his male identity gives him an advantage in becoming a funu Geo and become perceived as trustworthy, reliable, and understanding women's needs. Yeah, just wanted to add that.
That's possible. I think that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I think we're at time. The hour passed way too quickly, and I think there would be much to talk about still. Thank you for this really, really interesting talk. Very excellent presentation and fascinating research that you shared. Thank you also to Amy, Dr. Hanser, for sharing some thoughts on that same topic and on the presentation. That was really interesting and got us started thinking, generating some questions for the discussion. Thank you all very, very much. And I'm sorry I missed mentioning this also earlier, but thank you, Lisa, also for helping with organizing this event. So yeah, the recording will be posted on the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs YouTube channel. I think it will take a couple of days, but there's the option to review the presentation and the discussion online. So thank you very much, everyone. And good night to Dr. Meng, and for everyone else here in Canada.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for taking part.
Thank you.